Hi, I'm Josh, and I am so grateful that you've decided to spend some of your very valuable leisure time with me as I talk about the board games that I played and purchased in the month of April. So I had two gaming sessions in April. The first one was a 2-player session, and the second one was a big 5-player game. So in terms of my 2-player gaming session, we played 2 games, and both of them happened to be the games that I purchased in the previous month, in March. These are games that I purchased used through auctions on BoardGameGeek.com. The first of these games is called Traders of Osaka. This little game is designed by Susumu Kawasaki, and it is a re-implementation of a previous game that I think was called Traders of Carthage. Regardless, I never did play the previous game. I've only just played this version of it now. So this is a very simple game in which players are collecting money to purchase goods so that when the ships that match the corresponding goods colors reach the end of their journey at Edo, players can then sell the corresponding goods or essentially convert them to victory points, at which point the corresponding ship will go back to the beginning of its journey and start its journey all over again. So there's a certain amount of importance in the timing of acquiring goods as you see the ships approaching the end of their journey, and there's also some dangers where players can potentially lose goods if ships end up in certain danger zones during the journey. So even though it's a very simple game, there are some certain things to keep track of. In addition to what your opponent is doing, you're kind of wanting to manipulate the way things play out based on what your opponent is collecting in terms of the goods that they have. And it's all done through pretty simple card play where every card has multiple uses. So a card can be used for gold to purchase more goods. A card can be used for its insurance value in order to save some of your higher value goods, or a card can be used for its goods value to score you points. So it's a multi-use card system, and players have to decide how best to use the cards with the simple actions that they're taking during the game. Now, I've only played this 2 players, and while it does play 2 to 4, I don't think 4 would work very well. I could see 3 players being interesting. I'm not sure if I'd want to try playing it with 4. 2 players does also work very, very well. It's a game that I thought was really clever and very unique in that it takes this very simple rule set and turns it into a game with very interesting decisions while maintaining a very quick gameplay. So I rated it a 7 out of 10, sort of pushing up towards a 7.5 maybe, but for now it was a 7 out of 10. My friend who I played with did rate it 7.5 out of 10, so we were pretty close on our ratings. We both definitely enjoyed Traders of Osaka. The second game we played was the other game that I had purchased, and it is Codenames Duet, which is a strictly 2 players cooperative version of the original Codenames. If you are familiar with Codenames, it is an extremely clever, very thinky word game that is played best as a group of probably about 6 players in 2 teams, where each team can have a clue giver and a couple of guessers. And it's a lot of fun. But what they did with the duet version I thought was so incredibly clever. They have turned this into just an amazing cooperative experience for 2 players. I'm really impressed with how they've done it. It's still the same kind of thinky game where you're trying to give clues to your partner to have them guess certain words while they're doing the same back to you. And there are variable levels of difficulty, as well as an interesting little campaign mode where players can go through this series of games, each one changing things up just a little bit to make the game more challenging in different ways. So it's such a clever design, and it is a lot of fun. I rate the game 8 out of 10. My friend rated it 8.5 out of 10. So obviously we both thought very highly of Codenames Duet. Now the third game, I took some notes because it was a big one. I went to visit my youngest brother who hosted this very large game of Conquest with 5 players. Now, going back in my board game history, I had a real fondness for the game Shogun or Samurai Swords by Milton Bradley way back in the day. And because of that, when I rediscovered modern board gaming in about 2003, I ended up really latching onto this game called Attack which ultimately became Attack Deluxe. And these games shared similarities with games like Axis and Allies, where players would start off with a very small army, a couple of territories, and sort of Risk-like, they would grow their armies, expand their territories, try to conquer the world, and they had more rules and more depth than a basic game of Risk, but they were essentially the same kind of framework. These giant games of conquest are called 4X games, where players are exploring, expanding, exploiting, and exterminating. And that used to be my very favorite genre of board games, and in fact Attack Deluxe was my favorite game for many years. And really the foundation for this type of game was laid by the Milton Bradley Game Master series of games that included Shogun and Axis and Allies and a few others back in the 1980s. So the game we played was called Conquest of the Empire, which was a reworking of the original Conquest of the Empire, which was one of those Milton Bradley Game Master games that was originally released in 1986. And what they did with the newer edition, which was released in 2005, was they actually kept the classic game rules, but they also made a whole new set of updated rules that they called the Conquest of the Empire 2 rules. So they actually included both rule books in the game, and the production value of this game, as with many of these big Game Master titles, was through the roof. It's just a huge game, loads of plastic Roman armies and cities, and visually it is quite the amazingly produced game. So this is one of the games I owned back in the day, and it was one of my favorites. Like I said, this genre was one that I was really big on, and I rated the game 9 out of 10 when I rated it back in 2008. So I was excited to get back to it after all those years, and we played this 5-player game that, after the rules explanation, ended up taking about 5 hours to play through the game, which was fine. It is one of those big games that is going to be a full afternoon or a full evening experience. The problem with that is there's not a lot to do typically when other players are taking their turns. So with a 5-player game that lasts 5 hours, you've got about 4 hours of downtime and about 1 hour of taking your own actions on your own turn. Now, there's the occasional battle happening on other players' turns when you get attacked, so it's not completely dead time. But the fact is, you spend a good amount of those 4 hours of other players' turns kind of just sitting around waiting for your turn to come back around. Now, what made that game time a little bit difficult was the fact that one of the players in the game, in the very first turn of the game, came over and attacked me in force, and I successfully defended, managed to beat them back, but in the process, their army got essentially destroyed, and right from turn 1, they were basically out of it for the rest of the game. They were not at all competitive. They had the lowest victory points throughout the entire game. It is a point-based system based on controlling territories and that sort of thing. So this poor player had to play out the remaining 4.5 hours of the game knowing that they really weren't in contention. And I was in a similar situation. Even though I'd successfully beaten back this player, I was weakened in the process, and I was basically second last in the running throughout the game as well, and wasn't really in contention either. The other issue with this is that it's a very static game. At least the Conquest of the Empire 2 rules are. It really focuses players into a handful of territories that are worth points and income, as opposed to the classic game where the income gain is spread out throughout the entire map. These second edition rules really focus you down into a few territories, which gives you the advantage of forcing players to kind of come into conflict with each other, as opposed to going off into their own little corners and just sitting there in a defensive mode. You do need to interact with players, which is a positive thing. However, I found that in the early weakened state I was in, I essentially held 2 territories throughout pretty much all of those 5 hours of gameplay, until the very end, when I finally just went on a big expansion spree, knowing that the game end was near. Didn't really care if I got destroyed in the process. But essentially for most of those 5 hours, I had my little 2 territories and squabbled over another one here and there, tried to defend them from other attackers. But it was a pretty static game experience for me. There wasn't a lot of dynamic movement and action on the game board. So I do wonder if the classic rules do allow for a little more ebb and flow and movement throughout the map as players grab more territories as opposed to focusing in on defending a very few valuable territories. But I was impressed with the simplicity of the game despite its size. I was expecting a more complex experience. I forgot how very straightforward a game it was. It really was very Risk-like, but with some interesting elements added on top, such as the alliance system that happens every turn where you're forced to kind of ally with certain players, and the Senate votes where you can gain power in the Senate and use that to vote for things that happen throughout the game that may give you certain benefits, or you might get outvoted by other players and they might gain the benefits. So there are some interesting twists to kind of the basic Risk-like experience, and at the same time, though, it remained a very straightforward gameplay experience. So, like I said, this is a game that I loved, that I rated 9 out of 10 in 2008. So what do I rate it now after coming back to it about 14 years later? Well, the thing is, I've really gone off of that style of game. I don't have as much interest in attacking other players and tearing down what they're trying to build. I've really become much more of a Care Bear as my gaming years have gone on, and I'm really less into the heavily conflict-based games. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. I still think Nexus Ops is a really great little game, mostly because it does something very similar, but in a much, much quicker gameplay experience. So yeah, you can bash on each other, but the game is short, and you're never really out of it unless a really unusual circumstances comes up. So it's not like I've totally put those type of games behind me, but they're really just not my thing anymore. And I ended up rating Conquest of the Empire 4.5 out of 10. And it's not that I didn't enjoy the game experience. I did have fun hanging out with my brother and his friends and just enjoying an afternoon of gaming together, chucking some dice and conquering some territories and that sort of thing. So if I was invited back to play again, I would definitely go back and do it again and try out some different strategies now that I'm more familiar again with the game. But as far as the game itself goes, it's not really my cup of tea anymore. So while I would play it again in a heartbeat, it wouldn't be one that I would repurchase and put back on my shelf by any means. Before I go on and talk about the games that I purchased in April, let me just take a quick second to send out a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. One of my supporters, Paul, recently increased his monthly pledge, which really blew me away. Literally every single time somebody signs up for my Patreon or increases their pledge, I get really choked up because that level of support just is so meaningful to me. So thank you, Paul, and thank you to the rest of you who support me in this amazing, very real way. Now let's talk about the games that I purchased. Once again, these were coming from a local-ish, Ontario-based game auction. These were used games that people were putting up for sale, and being my birthday month, I decided to treat myself to a few new-to-me board games. The first of which is a game called New York Zoo. This, if you're at all familiar with Uwe Rosenberg, is one of his polyomino tile-laying type games, a style of game that he's become very well known for. I've played a few of them and quite enjoyed them. In particular, Patchwork is a very simple game from him that has been a huge hit and that I've enjoyed quite a lot. And really, I would say that New York Zoo is kind of a cross between Patchwork and Barren Park with kind of an interesting animal mechanism thrown in there. So it is pretty straightforward. It is very much one of these polyomino style games where you're trying to be the first one to fill in your board to win the game. And it's got all these really amazing little wooden animal pieces too. So New York Zoo was one that I picked up. Now, both of the other ones that I purchased are train themed games, which is a theme that I've always really enjoyed. There's just something about building networks and picking up and delivering goods through the networks that's always appealed to me. One of my favorite games over the years was Railways of the World, which is just a huge game of creating train networks and delivering cubes for points. I eventually did sell it because it is kind of a gigantic, unwieldy game in terms of that genre, and I was looking more for kind of simpler games and easier ones to kind of just set up and play. But all that being said, the first one that I purchased was Trains, and I also picked up the Trains Rising Sun standalone expansion along with it, and another expansion map. So I got a bunch of content for this game, which is essentially the game of Dominion played out on a game board. The Dominion influence is very strong in the original game of Trains. It is a game that I have played years ago and enjoyed quite a bit. So as with Dominion, players are starting with a basic set of cards, and over the game they are building up their decks to more powerful cards and using those cards to lay track and deliver goods. And so it's very much like they took Dominion and turned it into your standard train game, which I think is a wonderful combination. I really enjoy deck building games that employ board-based gameplay. There's something about that combination that really hits on all cylinders for me. Hits on all cylinders, is that the right phrase? It's something that I enjoy quite a bit anyways. So that's the first train game or games. The second one is called Maglev Metro by Ted Alspach. Once again, players are laying track and using their train routes to deliver passengers, and this is all in kind of a weird futuristic setting with robots and stuff like that, which isn't as interesting a theme for me as sort of classic Wild West sort of age of train stuff. But regardless, it's the gameplay that really interested me when I started to look into this one. So the whole system is kind of like an engine building game married with a train game. So like Trains was deck building with the train game, this is engine building with a train game. There's a lot of ways that players can enhance their system of building track, delivering passengers, all the actions that they take in the game. There's so many different ways that players can improve the efficiency of their system, and by the end of the game, their whole network is going to be very different than it was at the beginning of the game. So that's really what was highly appealing to me. And despite the weird theme, it does have pretty cool components. It has these kind of clear track tiles where you can play over top of other players' track tiles and not cover them up. You can see all the tracks individually. But this is one that I haven't played yet, and I am excited to try it out. So those are my new to me games for April. Tell me what you have been playing. I'm really interested in hearing what's been hitting your table lately. What games have you purchased lately, or even crowdfunded on Kickstarter or elsewhere? You know I'm always interested in hearing what you're up to in terms of the board games, so please do let me know in the comments, and thank you as always for watching. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following. Give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers! The board games that I played and purchased in the month of March. In which players can purchase insurance, this and very quick play, completely downtime. I was that, and I'm very much. It's very much one of these polyomino tile type of games, as big board game